Welcome back, House Representative and the Democratic nominee for Missouri Secretary of State, Barbara Phifer, is now on the record. She joins us in studio. It's good to have you with us.
Well, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here.
I want to ask you to respond to comments that your opponent, Denny Hoskins, the Republican, has made. He says you want to put pornography in libraries for kids. You're also a Methodist pastor. Those two things don't seem to go hand in hand with me. Do you want to clarify your position?
You know, I read that online this week, and I was torn between being totally flabbergasted and just laughing out loud. It's the most absurd thing I've ever heard in my life. I have no idea why he would think that. All I believe is that parents are the ones that should decide what their children should read, and that local libraries, with their library boards, decide what should be in the library. They're the ones that are paying the money for their libraries, and they're the ones that decide.
The Secretary of State does have some funding that goes to local libraries.
Yes.
Is that a lever you would use to alter their behavior?
No.
In any way?
I don't believe so, no.
What if libraries were banning books outright, books you believe should be available to everyone?
I don't think that it's my function to do that.
Let the locals decide.
Absolutely. 97% of the money for local libraries comes from localities. And you know, there's a wide variety of the kinds of books that people want in their local libraries. There are areas that have more people who are multilingual than others. There are, in fact, I was talking to somebody who has a large Mennonite population in their area, and so the Mennonites have asked for certain books to be bought for their children to read, and the local library has tried to be sensitive to that. I think it's great.
You've spent many years in the state legislature.
Yes.
Look, in the internet and in the world of artificial intelligence, there are many, obscene images and things that could be out there, and there are often age limits. There are labels that accompany information for sensitive materials to help warn families. This is what you're about to get into.
Sure.
When it comes to the printed word and things that are on the shelves in library books, are there things out there in the universe of materials that you would find insulting or offensive for minors or kids to be partaking in at a public facility?
Well, there's things I certainly wouldn't want my grandchildren to read, but I'm not a parent anymore. But I think you're missing the point.
Well, I'm getting to the point,
Okay.
which is that why do you trust the current protocols, the current systems that are in place to properly filter, label, or protect kids from that kind of content?
Because ultimately, that's what democracy is all about. The Secretary of State isn't somebody who just waves a magic wand and says, poof, that's going to happen. We really have a great system. All the local libraries in the state of Missouri have library boards that are appointed by elected officials. And so every community has the ability to make the decision of who they want on those boards.
We just don't often see the library board candidates' commercials running on the TV airwaves because they're not very well funded. But you're right, those are decisions that are made and people can have input.
Absolutely, and that's what democracy is all about.
You mentioned a Secretary of State or any executive waving a magic wand. We asked Senator Hoskins, would you take any steps outside of just persuading the legislature to implement your plan to get rid of these voting machines? He said no. He would have to go. He's relenting or acknowledging the reality that he'd have to change the law to ditch voting machines. You disagree with him on that?
No, well,
you disagree with him on ditching voting machines, not on executive power.
Exactly. Yeah, that would be the best way to describe that. He and I simply have a policy difference on whether or not we should be using voting machines. But yes, the job of the Secretary of State is not to advocate for one position or another. The job of the Secretary of State is to fulfill the law.
The commonly used line around elections and election integrity is that as a society, we'd like to make it easy to vote and harder to cheat.
Yeah, I think that's great.
Let's separate those out for a moment. Is there anything you can do in Missouri to make it easier to vote?
In terms of the way the law is currently written, I don't think so. But we do have early voting now. And
the law requires a photo ID. Some people don't have one.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yes, and in fact, hold on to that thought because I'll get back to it. So in terms of early voting, I think it's a great idea, but of course we follow the law. In terms of absentee ballots, I think it's a great idea, but we follow the law. In terms of using voting machines, I think it's a really important thing, but we follow the law. That's what the Secretary of State does. Now, when you talk about voter ID, we have some real problems in areas of Missouri with people having access to voter IDs, especially rural areas.
Even though the state says it will pay the costs for those voter IDs?
Yeah, but the reason is not the cost. The reason is getting access to them. Because we have areas where it's very hard to get a driver's license or to get a non-driver's license ID.
Why is that?
Because the DMVs are closing shop and leaving the rural areas. They can't make enough money with the current fee structure. And so we've had DMVs closing across the state. We've even had that here in the city of St. Louis. So one of the things that I've been researching is the idea of mobile units. And in Michigan, for example, that's what they do in rural areas.
So taking a driver's license printer to them?
Well, and not just the
In
printer, also all the computers.
The administration gear.
Yes, exactly. And Michigan has been doing this for a couple of years, and in fact, they're expanding the program. And I would really love to see us doing that. I'm also very concerned about our elders, because as people are no longer able to drive, they have to get a non-driver's license.
So I hear you describing ways
ID.
to get IDs in more hands. I don't
Yes.
hear you saying that you want to repeal the requirement to have voter ID.
That's not the purpose of or function of the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State follows the law. And so,
Is that a law you'd like to see changed?
you know, there are some things about it that concern me. You know, people always have to prove their citizenship, their registration, their residency in Missouri when they register to vote. And so, you know, for most of the history of Missouri, we've not had photo IDs. It's just brand new. There has been
Well, where's the victim?
Excuse me, I was going to say there's no record of any fraud without voter IDs. So,
In showing one, does it create a victim? Is there someone who's left out if you have to show one?
you know, fewer and fewer. And that's, you know, it's an interesting question. When I first became an adult, there were a lot of people without birth certificates. There are not that many people without birth certificates in Missouri anymore.
Yeah.
My father was born at home, for example.
This has been an interesting conversation in how we could make it easier to vote. Let's shift now to what we could do to make it harder to cheat. Anything you would do there?
We don't have a problem with cheating in Missouri. So I think sometimes we have solutions in search of a problem. And certainly if we have evidence of cheating, we need to find out what that is and work on it. Again, that's something for the legislature to do.
Part of it is in administrating voter rolls, like who's a current voter,
Right.
who's moved in or out of state, who's died.
Right.
And the current Secretary of State scrapped ERIC, the Electronic Registration Information Center. There are other alternatives to it, and there's ERIC itself. Would you bring ERIC back, something else, something similar? Does the state need to have a way to speak to other states to know when a voter...
I think it's a good idea. I really do. And Eric is bipartisan. I have never really understood the argument to scrap it. I'm certainly open to looking at other systems. I think whichever is going to be most effective for Missouri. We have to remember that it's local counties that really are doing the voter rolls. And so the Secretary of State needs to give whatever help they need. But certainly this issue of people moving across state lines, it happens all the time. And it just doesn't make sense to me that we're kind of putting one hand behind our back by not participating in ERIC.
Maybe you've seen, but a lot of the attention, a lot of the money in Missouri this year has gone, you know, look, yes, there's the presidential race, but there are these big amendment questions. That's driving a lot of money.
Yes, it
There's
is.
the governor's race. There's a lot of money going there. There hasn't been as much money going to the down ballot statewide races like yours,
Right.
but even in that, you're recently outraising your Republican opponent. How do you describe that shift? Why are donors looking your direction more frequently than they are Denny Hoskins these days?
Well, all I know is what I discern from people who are talking to me. So this is not scientific. But it seems to me almost everybody I've ever met wants a system that is fair. And I don't have an agenda in terms of I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. My agenda is three things. First of all, to be professional. Secondly, to be honest. and thirdly, to be transparent. I really look at the Office of the Secretary of State as being the engine of democracy in Missouri. And I think we all need an umpire that is going to call the balls and call the strikes fairly. We don't want somebody who is for the Cardinals or somebody who's for the Royals. We want somebody who's going to look at what the evidence is impartially.
And you could do that.
Oh, absolutely.
Could Denny Hoskins?
I think that would be a question you need to talk to Denny Hoskins about. I am very concerned about what he says his agenda is. And anytime you come up with an agenda and say it's the conservative agenda or it's the liberal agenda, that concerns me in terms of the Office of the Secretary of State. Because the Office of the Secretary of State is not about being liberal or conservative. It is about preserving democracy and making the state function.
You're laying out the stakes for us in this race. Before we let you go, I just want to ask, there's all these big amendments on the ballot this year. The process of putting that question before voters goes through the Secretary of State's office.
Absolutely.
Is there anything you would do to change that process, the amendment process?
I want to make sure I understand your question. What is my personal preference or what I would do as a Secretary of State?
The current Secretary of State took action in court and through administrative action to modify language of how questions were written, trying to delay things here and there. And, you know, a future Secretary of State might support changes in the legislature by going to testify or advocating on behalf of changes that would make it harder or easier to change the Missouri State Constitution. So, open-ended question to you. Okay. Are you satisfied with the current process, or would you change it in some way?
Legally, I am satisfied with the current process. It has been in place over half of the history of Missouri. It began in 1906. I think that
if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Absolutely, and then, you know, over 100 years, we've only had 19 times, I think, that we've actually amended the Constitution from the initiative process by the people. Now, through the legislature, it's been over 100 times. People don't realize that. The legislature does it all the time, but through the people, very, very seldom does that occur. On the other hand, I have been extremely concerned by the actions of the current Secretary of State and the ways that he tried to say things that simply were not true in the summaries of the amendment
and the
petitions.
Courts said as much.
Oh yeah, they threw it out. In fact, I think the word was reprehensible. And frankly, that's a huge motivator for me to run for Secretary of State, because I absolutely pledge to the people of Missouri that they will be able to trust the language anytime there's a question for the people of Missouri.
How are you voting on Amendment 3?
Me, personally, yes.
That's the big abortion question.
Yes.
Why?
Because I am a mom, I'm a grandma, I have given birth 3 times. I know the joy of being a parent and a mother. I also know the cost to one's body. I experienced what's called a missed abortion in my first pregnancy. I was in seminary and the fetus died, but did not miscarry. And for over a month, I carried a dead fetus and could have died. And I am absolutely adamant that the health of women has to come first. And in the state of Missouri right now, that's not true.
She's House Democrat Barbara Phifer, running for Missouri Secretary of State. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, well, thank you so much.